Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jennie Stevens, one of our joint fellows with the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability. Jennie began her first faculty position in environmental studies in the last week of August 2005. The same week that Hurricane Katrina landed on the Gulf Coast. In its wake, Hurricane Katrina left over 1,800 people dead, more than $97 billion in damages, and laid bare the inequalities entrenched in the social and economic systems. With such vast devastation, Jennie thought that this major climate disruption would catalyze social change. Since that time in 2005, Jennie's transdisciplinary work as a scholar, activist, and educator focused on climate justice and energy democracy. She has explored the role of colleges and universities in bringing about structural change in society. Institutions of higher education are uniquely suited to achieve systemic social change, advance climate justice, and accelerate the phase-out of fossil fuels. So why don't they? In the near 2 decades since Hurricane Katrina, a new status quo, one accustomed to increasing climate disruption, has taken root in lieu of comprehensive systemic change Jennie had hoped for. In her current book project, she challenges the exclusionary and exploitative histories of American colleges and universities, and the increase in financialization that prevent large-scale change. In doing so, she is inviting readers to reimagine the role of that higher education plays in achieving a healthy and more equitable future for both people and the planet. Today, the Q&A session of the program will be moderated by Lyndon von Mutius, who is the director of the Climate Action Accelerator here at Harvard. And with that, and without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Jennie Stevens to the podium.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you those who are joining remotely. It's an honor to be here, and especially during this very turbulent and difficult time in the world. I want to thank Radcliffe and the Salata Institute, but particularly Radcliffe for creating the spaces for us to have challenging conversations. And I want to begin by recognizing in September, Harvard inaugurated their first Black woman president, Claudine Gay, and in her inauguration speech, she inspired us all to be courageous and to ask not just why, but why not? And I think that's what my project and my work explores, is why are we so ineffective in addressing the challenges that we know why they're happening and how they're happening, yet we are unable to. So that's what I would like to spend the time today talking with all of you about. So some of us have begun to use this word polycrises. We have a mental health crisis, which is causing gun violence and opioid crisis in the United States. We're disconnected from each other and from our communities. We have crisis of precarity. We have the cost of living crisis, housing crisis, food and energy crises. We have financial crisis and the crisis of debt. And we have ecological crises, the biodiversity crisis, plastic pollution crisis, and of course, we also have the horrors of war. On top of all of this, we also have the climate crisis, which, because of the pace of change, it is exacerbating all of the other crises, and it is making worse the vulnerabilities, the inequities, and disparities to the vulnerabilities to all of these crises. We have big efforts around the world to address some of these challenges, but we're not meeting the goals. And we're really going in the wrong direction on a lot of fronts. So this is global CO2 emissions. It's continuing to go up, despite over 30 years of international climate negotiations, with the next COP coming up at the end of this month. And fossil fuel companies have no plans to stop extracting fossil fuels, so there's really not much reason to believe that this won't just continue to go up. With Sustainable Development Goals, again, we're going in the wrong direction on many of them. So we're really not in a good place, right? And many of us can feel it, right? We feel it viscerally. And so one question that I want to invite us all to explore together is why? Why are we so ineffective at confronting these challenges? We know so much. We have so much science. We have so much analysis. We know a lot about these problems. We know a lot about how human beings work. We know a lot about the ecology of the Earth systems. But why can we not address these problems? And all of you probably have your own ideas about why. Based on our backgrounds, our experiences in life, based on our educational, formal, informal training, we all may have different ideas about why. But based on my experience the past 30 years working on these issues, mostly in academic settings, I've come down to like two big reasons why. And I want to share those with you, and then explore how we might, in our universities, in our higher education institutions, address these two things. So the first is a concentration of wealth and power. So over the past few decades, during the same time that we've been aware of the climate crisis, we've had every year more billionaires, and we have fewer and fewer people getting really, really, really super rich. And the problem with that is not just that may seem unfair because some people are rich and other people are not, but the problem with that is that it's based on exploitation and extraction. The only way the rich people are getting rich is because it's worse for everyone else. And we don't always recognize that. We think, oh, they're billionaires, they're cool, they come up with good ideas. But it's actually really problematic that there are so many billionaires. I've drawn heavily and been really inspired by this book on wealth supremacy by Marjorie Kelly. Many of us might be familiar with the bias of white supremacy, but what she articulates is that we have a bias toward wealth supremacy. Wealthy people's lives are more important than poor people's lives. Our policies and our practices and our priorities and our institutions are geared toward wealthy people and getting more special people to be wealthy. It's all about kind of this accumulation and financialization, and it is a bias that we all have, and in some cultures, in some communities, it is stronger than others. And arguably in the United States, the country where we are right now, it is particularly strong. And in some of our institutions, including Harvard, it is also strong. So the second reason that I think we've been so ineffective is connected to the concentration of wealth and power, but it's about fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are this amazing resource that the Earth system has, right? And we, human beings, have found fossil fuels. We've been able to burn the fuel for all kinds of reasons, right? And all kinds of development and positive things have come out of that, but also a lot of very negative things have come out of that. And we know that the burning of fossil fuels is the primary contributor to the climate crisis. But although we know that, the science is super, super clear. Because of this concentration of wealth and power, we have been unable to phase out fossil fuels. The reason for that is not because we don't have the technology, we don't know the alternatives, we don't know. It's really interconnected with this concentration of wealth and power because a lot of the wealth is coming from the fossil fuels. A lot of the geopolitical conflicts of the day are related to the complexities of protecting fossil fuel interests and struggles over who gets to benefit, whose wealth and power gets to be concentrated because of fossil fuels. So the dangers of this are also that fossil fuel interests have permeated our governance structures around the world. Fossil fuel interests, despite what we know about climate change, despite other negative health disparities associated with fossil fuels, our governments around the world are continuing to subsidize fossil fuels. And to a degree that also fossil fuel interests are now embedded in our climate negotiation, international climate policy efforts, and there's just, basically, we think of public policy, I'm a professor at a public policy school, we think of public policy for the public good, but so much of our public policy is now for the benefit of corporate interests, including fossil fuel interests. So this is why I propose we're so ineffective in addressing the polycrises. And what I suggest, and many others around the world in global solidarity, think we need a paradigm shift focused on climate justice. And what I want to do now is explain what climate justice is, as opposed to, and it's quite different than mainstream climate action. One very clear articulation from Colette Pichon-Battle is that climate change is pointing out that climate change is not the problem, but climate change is a symptom of the bigger problem, right? And that connects with what I was saying earlier. And so when we just focus on climate change and try to somehow fix climate change, we are not getting at the root cause. And a lot of mainstream climate action thinks about climate in isolation of other issues and doesn't get to the root. So climate justice, my definition of climate justice is it's about connecting climate action with social justice, economic justice, racial justice, making investments in people, communities, and households who've been underinvested in for so long, and leveraging the urgency of the climate crisis for big investments and new ways of structuring society. This is not, as I said, what mainstream climate action and climate policy has been focused on. A lot of climate policy and climate science and technology and advocacy, I categorize as climate isolationism, which I think has been proven over the last 30 years that it's ineffective and insufficient, right? Climate isolationism is what I refer to as a focus narrowly on decarbonization and greenhouse gas emission reductions, assuming that individual behavior change or market-based mechanisms and technology can address the crisis. And I think we have evidence that it isn't sufficient. And I think we need to move away from climate isolationism toward a more broad, holistic, integrated climate justice perspective. So transformative climate justice is really about systems change. It requires disruption of power dynamics. Therefore, it'll make a lot of people very uncomfortable, right? And it isn't easy to imagine what a climate justice future could be. But we're at a point in human history where we have to mainstream bigger disruption and transformative changes. So in 2020, I wrote a book called Diversifying Power, Why We Need Antiracist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And in that book, I pointed to this challenge of moving from climate isolationism to climate justice, and I pointed out that you need different people in the room, right? Different people with different experiences, different priorities, different backgrounds, engaging on these issues of climate in order to be able to even imagine what this climate justice future could be. And in that book, I have a chapter connecting climate and energy with housing, food, economics and jobs, transportation, and health. I wanted to add a chapter about education, but my editor said, no, that's too much, it's a little tangential, climate and education are not really connected, so why don't you not have a chapter on education? So this book does not have a chapter on education. So what I decided to do was my next book be about climate, justice, and education. And because most of my career has been in higher education, the book is about higher education. Obviously, higher education is very connected to earlier K through 12, earlier education, as well as lifelong learning and informal education beyond. So the principles apply more broadly to education, but the specifics are looking at higher education. So when we think about higher education, it's really important to recognize the history of higher education institutions. And for the most part, universities around the world have been established as part of a colonial project. White supremacist and patriarchal principles are at the core, right? Very intentional exclusion of certain kinds of people, exclusion of certain kinds of ideas, and very more oriented and strategic than we sometimes think. We think of universities as free inquiry about everything and anything, which is, the goal. But we have to acknowledge the legacy of these institutions, higher education institutions. And I think it's really important, because of that history, to center justice at the core of what educational institutions are all about. And so this is where I suggest that all higher educational institutions in particular, should embrace feminist, anti-colonial, anti-racist lens. Because when we don't, what we're doing is perpetuating the legacy of the prior orientations within those institutions. So within higher education and more broadly, we have the opportunity in what we do, what we teach, what we practice, what we do research on, how we engage, to do things in a way that are either resisting oppression, imperialism, coloniality, racism, misogyny, transphobia, or reinforcing. And again, I want to make the point that while I've put this up as like a dichotomy, of course we're all part of these complex systems and complex institutions, and some parts of what we do are probably some of the time reinforcing and some of the time resisting, and we can't always be one or the other necessarily, but we need to be aware and paying attention to these power dynamics and the legacy that these complex power dynamics bring to our institutions. So the book that I'm writing is going to contribute to this emerging field that I didn't really know that much about until a few years ago, of critical university studies. And people are realizing how important universities are to society, and that it's worth paying attention and not just thinking of all universities as good, good and all simplistic kind of notions that all education is good, or bad. Again, I'm not trying to make that binary here, but just that it's worth exploring them with more of a critical lens of the power that is associated with higher education. So the framework that I'm using in thinking about higher education institutions is to connect knowledge with wealth and power. So we often think of our universities and higher education as places of knowledge dissemination, knowledge creation, knowledge exploration. But it's also really important to recognize how that knowledge is connected to both wealth and power. So we can think of this framework in terms of individuals. A student comes to university, gains knowledge, gets a degree, then is able to get a job, accumulate some wealth, and become a powerful, engaged member of society, right? But that isn't the way I'm using this framework, or what I'm most interested in is structural, systemic, society-wide ways of thinking about knowledge, wealth, and power, and the role of higher education institutions beyond the individual student. And so with regard to knowledge, we teach and we do research. We also, obviously every university, every higher education institution needs to be funded somehow, right? And so that's where the financial flows come from. And then there are all kinds of relationships in our higher education institutions that are connected to the financial flows and to the kinds of knowledge and the kinds of teaching and research that we do. So I propose, and again from a critical university studies perspective, that universities and some of our higher education institutions are actually contributing to a concentration of wealth and power. And it has also been suggested that universities are perpetuating fossil fuel reliance. So what I'm asking in my work is, can we reimagine higher education to do the opposite? To instead distribute wealth and power, what if that was one of our missions and goals, and phase out fossil fuels? And those are kind of two of the big ideas that I'm exploring as I propose how to reimagine universities that would have a climate justice focus. So what I want to do in the remaining time is just go through a few kind of points that I'm making in the work, in the book, that I think are really important. One is about knowledge hierarchies. And again, we think of universities as free inquiry about anything and everything. Yet, we also are very constrained in our universities with disciplinary orientation, and we have to recognize the legacy of our knowledge hierarchies. As I mentioned, most universities are kind of Eurocentric project that prioritize some kinds of knowledge over others. And some of the kinds of knowledge that we have lost, that we don't teach or don't engage with very much in our universities, is relational knowledge, how we're connected to each other, to the earth, to the land, to ecosystems. We're kind of, out of our, we're not promoting relational knowledge and supporting that very well. Embodied knowledge, what do our bodies tell us about how we're feeling, how we're connected or not, and we're very much go into the classroom and think about in our brains, not in our bodies. So we also have lost embodied knowledge. And also local knowledge. So because of kind of a assumption of, there's a canon of knowledge that people in specific fields should know, it's become kind of oftentimes disconnected from local. So people, again, it has made us disconnected from our local communities and local places where we're based. Vandana Shiva has suggested that we have grandmothers' universities, right? This is an outside-the-box idea of every community around the world should have some kind of a university, an infrastructure to honor and pass on and keep live the knowledge that women or others who aren't part of the formal educational system, perhaps, how to keep that knowledge alive. So that's just one example. Another idea that I want to focus on, and that I'm structuring part of the book around, is about unlearning. So this obviously is a little bit of a provocative thing because we're in universities. We think about learning as one of the core missions of universities. But I think it's important to think about this idea of unlearning. And it's been used when people talk about people converting religions, or in psychology, other ideas. But I think it's actually really important to think about the idea of unlearning when we're thinking about higher education. And to demonstrate what I mean by unlearning, I want to tell a story about a student of mine who came, it was about 5 or 6 years ago. At the end of the semester, he came to my office to thank me for the semester. He enjoyed the class, and he wanted to tell me, thank me for the semester. And he said to me, one of the most wonderful things anyone has ever said to me. He said, the beginning of the semester, I was like a fish swimming around a fishbowl. But now, at the end of the semester, I feel like I'm a fish swimming in the ocean, and I will be swimming in the ocean the rest of my life. And it was just such a gift, and it was such a small, quick comment, like he wasn't elaborating, he just said that, and then said thank you, and he left, and it was. But I think that, for me, is what I mean by unlearning. We're all stuck in our fish bowls, swimming round and round, and if we are able to break down some of those constraints, then we have opportunity that we can't even imagine before we get out of the fishbowl. And obviously that concept is what the whole idea of education as liberation is based on. So examples of things that I think are really important that we start to unlearn in our universities is neoliberal economics. And I know there's some economists in the room, and we heard an economics talk yesterday. But I think it's getting very clear to many people around the world, and to many of us, including many economists, that the assumption of continual growth and expansion and how that has led to financialization and this concentration of wealth and power is completely at odds with the best interest of humanity and the Earth and the planet. And because it doesn't take into consideration the planetary boundaries and the limits and constraints. And we are teaching students within a framework of economics that is disconnected from reality. And I'm Irish. I was born in Ireland, and my family moved to Boston when I was a kid. And I was back last year, and I happened to be at an event held by the President of Ireland. And Irish people have a strong sense of justice. They were a colonized, oppressed people for centuries. And the President of Ireland said in a public talk that our failure to facilitate a pluralism of approaches in teaching economics is a deprivation of basic students' rights, indeed citizen rights, leading to a narrow, blinkered, and distorted education. So this is a pretty bold statement for a head of state to make about economists, and obviously it created quite a bit of controversy. A lot of economists got very defensive, saying that he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's not an economist, so how could he know? But the point he's making is that this neoliberal economics framework that dominates so much of what our students are being taught in our universities is just so narrow and disconnected from so much of what's happening in the world. So instead, we could be teaching a plurality of economic theory and economic ideas, including ecological economics, feminist economics, degrowth economics, a caring economy, and this vision. There are alternative views, and a solidarity economy is one that I think is very compelling of restructuring the society around an economy that's based on care and compassion and what people need, rather than an economy based on continuous growth and wealth accumulation for what end, to what end. So the interesting thing about unlearning economics, there are many others who are also calling for unlearning economics, and most of them are not in economics departments, because economics departments don't, there's this epistemic schism, and that economists are so focused on the way they see the world that they dismiss most of these other kinds of economic theory. So another concept that I want to introduce, sort of similar to the unlearning, how unlearning is to learning, I propose we need to spend a lot more attention on exnovation instead of innovation. So innovation, as you all know, is like the buzzword of every university, right? Innovate. We're going to innovate here. We're going to do things new and different all the time. Everything's new and different, and it's great. Innovation is about coming up with ideas that are new and different. And the assumption is that those new things will displace and substitute away from the old. But what we're finding, and the evidence shows, is that we're not actually moving away from the systems and materials and realities that don't serve us anymore. We're just doing more, right? So in energy, for example, we have renewable energy, but we're still using all the fossil fuels. So it's like we just have more. And so what I think we urgently need in our universities is research, not on more innovation research, but exnovation research. We need research on fossil fuel phase out. How can we do it? It's hard, right? But how can we do a coordinated global phase out of fossil fuels? In all the university research, I've been working in this my whole career, in all the university centers on climate and energy that I know of, there's none that are focused on fossil fuel phase out, which is the issue of the day, right? In different ways, they might be sort of, but they're not. That isn't what they say that they're about. And another example is plastics. The research now shows plastics are everywhere. Plastics not just in the oceans, plastics are now in our blood, microplastics. Microplastics have been found now in women's breast milk. So this doesn't sound good, but what are we doing about it? Why don't we have exnovation research on how to stop using plastics? But we don't. As far as I know, there aren't university research centers on either of these topics. What we do have is an example of the ultimate techno-fix, which is what I would consider a climate isolationism view is, we have climate change, temperature is going to increase, how can we reduce temperature, but not change anything else? And this is this idea of solar geoengineering. I don't want to get into the details of it because it's quite a big controversial topic, but many of our universities, including Harvard, has a solar geoengineering program that is studying how to inject sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere to cool the Earth. And I'm part of a network of collaborators who've written quite a bit about this, and I emphasizing the risks, the dangers, the injustices of creating one more mechanism where the powerful have control over everyone else. So when we think about why are our universities studying solar geoengineering, but they're not studying fossil fuel phase out, it comes back to funding, right? People who, as researchers, we have to have funding for our work. And the solar geoengineering research has been funded mostly by tech bro, Silicon Valley philanthropists, and who follow a mindset of kind of technology can fix it, we don't understand the politics or the policies, and we don't need to make bigger structural, economic, or social changes. And we also have to acknowledge the influence of fossil fuel interests in our universities. And many of you are probably all familiar with fossil fuel divestment movements in universities around the world. And now that's moving on to fossil fuel dissociation, trying not just about the endowment, but also not having fossil fuel companies come to campus to recruit. But a lot of our universities have fossil fuel interests at the core. Like the board, fossil fuel executives are on the boards of many universities and are contributing in lots of big ways, including a lot of the climate and energy centers in the United States, at least. So there's a lot more work and activity, and this is building, and I think it's going to keep building. It's not going to go away. With just earlier this week, there was a lawsuit filed in 6 universities here in the United States about fossil fuel investments, and a great new paper just coined a new term called petroeducation, which talks about and explains the connections between fossil fuels and universities. So where the funding comes from for universities really does matter. And Naomi Reska's great work has showed that in the field of oceanography, the US Navy funded a large majority of oceanography research. And because of where the funding came from, even our cultural assumptions about the oceans are kind of influenced by that research that thinks more about the oceans of like water that we can zoom through and how does sound go through the water and that kind of thing, rather than thinking of the oceans as this abundance of life. So many people who, when you say where your funding comes from matters, might be defensive and say, oh, but the funder doesn't have any control over what we do research on. The fact is that the funder and the funding does at least shine a light toward a certain area, right? They may not have veto power over what the researchers do, but they are definitely funding certain things that they're interested in, right? For a specific reason. And so we have to acknowledge that. In my view, I think if we moved more from climate isolationism in universities to climate justice, we would have less research on solar geoengineering and a lot more focus on fossil fuel phase out. I want to speak just in the last few minutes about finance, a little bit more about the financial flows in universities. And this section is probably more specific to US higher education. The project on a whole is not specific only to the United States, but obviously my own experiences, I have more experience in the United States, and the United States does have a hegemonic influence over higher education around the world as well. But in the United States, we actually have a big decline in public funding. There are rural colleges closing, there's decline in enrollment, there's declining wages and job security of people who work in the universities. We're also seeing rising tuition, huge debt, increasing political pressure, increasing reliance on private donors who then get to determine what's happening in the universities, and increased antagonism and intimidation of the free speech ideal that universities are supposed to practice. So, in many ways, U.S. higher education is in crisis, and for so many reasons. But I think it's really problematic, and there's a lot to be discussed in that space. At the same time, we have Harvard and other very wealthy universities that have, it was released a couple of weeks ago, that the endowment here is $50.7 billion. And hedge fund billionaire last year donated another $300 million. And the previous president has extolled how generous and loyal all the alumni of Harvard are, right? So there's this cycle of you went to Harvard, you give back to Harvard, and you're rich because you went to Harvard, and then you're rich when you're at Harvard, so you give back to Harvard. So like there's a cycle there that I think we have to acknowledge and potentially disrupt, right? Like with the world in polycrises, why would one university have hoard this much resources, right? I mean, we're sitting here and benefiting from it. So I'm saying this, and I recognize the discomfort that this may bring, but I also think it's important for us to acknowledge. So are there alternative models? Can we think about public ownership, cooperative models of universities, debt-free access for all? And could we be connecting better with the communities and community needs in our universities? And specifically, I want to acknowledge the climate disruptions and devastation that more and more communities around the world are facing. That higher education, if we imagine a more distributed system of higher education, couldn't higher education institutions actually be part of the response in times of disruption? And obviously, in some places, including my colleagues at the University of Puerto Rico, they were, after Hurricane Maria, part of the response. But I also think there's a huge need in terms of this growing, increased, acute disasters that the climate crisis is bringing on us, and how can our universities just kind of muddle along and keep going when there's going to be more and more disruptions, and how can we imagine a different structure that enabled us to be more responsive to those disruptions. So in conclusion, I would just say that a climate justice framework is a paradigm shift away from individual behavior toward more collective and systems change, away from technological innovation toward more social innovation, away from maximizing profit and hoarding wealth to a sufficiency mindset in terms of well-being and how much do we need and do other people have enough. Instead of concentrating wealth and power, distributing wealth and power. Instead of focusing on innovation, focusing also on exnovation. And there are a lot of resources for those of you who are in universities and want to engage in some of these changes. There's an organization called Faculty for a Future that has a whole campaign for the people-powered university, how to make your university people-powered, and some other networks, international networks. I want to acknowledge all of the great students and collaborators who've contributed to this work. We had a paper with these students here are from Northeastern University, and we wrote a paper on climate justice in higher education that inspired this whole project that was part of a class from a few years ago. I also have an amazing group of students here at Harvard that I'm working with this semester, and I want to thank them for their contributions. I also want to acknowledge our colleagues here. Today is Day of the Dead, and it's a time to honor people who have inspired us. And two people that I want to call out are Shirley Chisholm was the first black woman to run for president in 1972, and her motto for her presidential campaign was unbossed and unbought. Quite a courageous woman. And Sinead O'Connor, who just died earlier this year, another courageous woman who encouraged us to fight the real enemy, however you define that. And I just want to come back to that story about my student and encourage us all to be thinking about how we can collectively break out of the constraints of the fish bowls that we're all in and swim together collectively in toward a better, more stable, healthy future for all. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was fantastic. We have a number of really great questions coming in through Slido. And I just want to encourage everyone who's sitting here in the room, if you'd like to submit a question, to scan that QR code, and that will auto-populate what I'm seeing here as well, so we can take some of your questions live. But I'd like to start, there are a number of related questions, and I'd like to start by asking you if you've seen an example of this kind of climate justice-centered curriculum in another country. Is there a country that you can point to where a different kind of educational culture prevails, or where you see teaching that doesn't just focus on neoliberal economics and rampant growth, and what we can learn from their higher education institutions?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a go-to example of a whole educational system that stands out as to demonstrate how to do this. But I think there's examples, lots of examples of people trying within their educational systems to change the way things are going. I will acknowledge there's an international network called Ecoversities of initiatives that are trying to change the way we imagine universities. And so the examples, if you go to the Ecoversity website, and it's a global network of very engaged, community-engaged learning spaces, that you wouldn't think of them as universities, what we think conceptualize as a university. So, but I think that's one example of the kinds of reimagining and restructuring and thinking about how could this educational infrastructure be designed very differently to meet the needs of people of now and in the future.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting, and I wanted to add a second question that came in. You and I both have experience teaching in an open education type model at the extension school here, but also in other contexts. And one of the folks is asking if you see a role for that kind of open knowledge or open education practice in making some progress in this field, or being perhaps even leading in some of this type of teaching. What does it look like to move towards more inclusive higher education?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different ways to think about that. I think in my own experience, and when you say open, do you mean who has access to?
Yeah, open enrollment is how I read this question.
Okay. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunities for breaking down the barriers of admission, right? Mm-hmm. And that's something that is a part of this for sure. And another way to think about it is thinking about again, more community-focused opportunities for co-design and co-learning. So in my own teaching, the students in my classes, usually we focus on a semester-long team project where students are working with partners, non-academic partners. So that with community organizations, usually who are working on climate justice or energy democracy issues. So that kind of partnership and service, and it's important, obviously, in that kind of engagement, not to have an extractive relationship, but have a contributing and cooperative engagement. So those are some of the examples in terms of how I've practiced some of these ideas in my own teaching.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really great. Maybe if I can even follow up on that. in a lot of today's elite institutions and research universities, the people who are teaching are still majority cis white male. In most corporate sustainability practitioner associations, cis white male leadership. In most environmental nonprofits, you have that same demographic leadership. How do you see elite research universities particularly, but perhaps bigger picture of the movement, showing up better for frontline communities in terms of community engagement and support, given that demographic reality?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I try to emphasize in my work is that the invitation to embrace a feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial perspective is open to all, right? You don't have to be a woman to be feminist. You don't have to be a person of color to bring anti-racist principles to your leadership. But all too often, obviously, people who haven't experienced the disadvantage from the structural oppression don't recognize it. So I think that's what the core of your question. And I think, I think just mainstreaming and engaging and speaking up about the power dynamics at every opportunity is essential. And even when it's hard and it's people don't want to hear it, and people also get very defensive, and people don't. So there's challenges there for sure. But I think the realities of the world are, we see both, like entrenchment, right, and defensiveness, and people shifting there. And I think this is why the focus on unlearning is so important, so that people can not get defensive and actually be open to thinking differently and recognizing the constraints and limits of their own perspective and biases.
I think there's a really great parallel to something I've heard in the environmental justice practitioner space, which is this: you've got to call in and call out at the same time. Because that's the only way that you can get existing power structures to think about shifting their views on leadership. Related to that, one of the questions here asks whether you can identify 1 to 3 concrete steps that Harvard might take. And I know you have spent not that much time here, but so far, perhaps in your research there are some things that you can recommend that the university focus on.
Sure. So I think embracing a justice-first lens is a mindset, and obviously it takes leadership to know what that even means, and be able to apply it. But I think Harvard has started to do that. Obviously with the Legacy of Slavery project and other initiatives. I think within the climate and energy space, it does seem like diversifying the perspectives beyond the technocratic science, technology, and economics lens, I think would be really important, because without that, as I said, there's risk of kind of perpetuating approaches that could actually delay and distract from bigger structural systemic changes. I think the amount of resources at places that have these big endowments, and not just Harvard, but other elite institutions, you can imagine all kinds of things that could be done with that money if just sustaining the just kind of continual accumulation wasn't the goal. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for thinking about having more distributed impact if there was an openness to change that model.
Mm-hmm. I think there are a couple of really great questions that are connected to each other, and I'm going to ask two of them as the last questions. Alongside connecting decarbonization and decolonization, and also thinking about that shift from geoengineering to geotherapy, heroic engineering versus thinking about how we can shepherd sort of more ecological husbandry approach to fixing the climate crisis. What are some of these strategies that you've seen be very effective in democratizing and decommodifying a university as approach to climate education and climate justice?
So again, the questions that ask for specific examples of how this has worked are challenging, because I don't think there are that many examples of this, because our higher education systems are stuck in the larger systems that we're all a part of. So, but that isn't to say as I said, that there are lots of smaller initiatives that are trying to have an impact here. Mm-hmm. Trying to think in terms of specific examples.
Well, perhaps I can follow up with one other person's question, which is, do you think it's more effective to try and fix a broken system, or do you think it's better to build a new system from scratch? And I'll couple that with my own personal observation, which is, I was chief of staff of an environmental organization that went through a major reorganization of its priorities around climate justice. And one of the critiques of that process from outsiders was, why are you wasting time on that? You've got to go fight climate change, right? There's this sort of like, we don't have time to reorganize and create new systems mentality that exists both in the movement outside and also within academia. So I guess that question is, what do you advocate for at the end of the day?
Yeah.
How do you thread that needle?
No, great question. And this gets to the issue of, radical versus incremental change too, right? Like often incremental change is kind of encourages complacency. Oh, we've made some progress, so therefore it's good, but then doesn't get us to the larger change, right? And so I think, it's always a balance and a struggle, and very contextualized in terms of what are the opportunities in different places and different organizations. My inclination is always to try to go right to the top, but that doesn't necessarily work when people don't see things the same way that you do, right? So, I joke sometimes, like, if only some of the billionaires, right, who would like to give money toward fossil fuel phase out instead of solar geoengineering, like, imagine what could be possible, but it's too complicated, right? Or it's too outside of their mindset. But I think this issue of focusing in on the public good and resisting powerful interests who are capturing and co-opting a lot of our governance systems is, recognition of it is becoming more mainstream, I think. And there's a point by which bigger disruption, I think, is inevitable and is coming, and it's already happened in some places. And and I think that's where I think we do have to acknowledge, and I try to be open about, that transformation does require disruption, right? If you're uncomfortable and trying to avoid confrontation and discomfort and disruption, and you just want stability, then it's not going to happen.
What's the point?
Right. So that's where the courage, back to the beginning, like, we have to be courageous in different ways, and it depends on the person and institution and the opportunities that we have to act on that courage.
Well, thank you so much, Jennie, for this incredibly compelling presentation and perspective and call to action. I want to thank the audience, both here in the room and online, for their compelling and terrific questions. And I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. And thank you again for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day.